Hi, everyone. My name is Gabby, and I am a hospice nurse and an end-of-life doula. I created a hospice Facebook page called the Hospice Heart, which now has 60,000 followers of the most amazing, kind, and compassionate people. And it's become a community of kindness. And it is basically around the topic of death and dying and everything that that might entail. And a common theme that I have noticed on this page is the topic of grief. And in our world in general, we have so much grief right now. But for the topic of this conversation, for the focus today is about grief at the end of life and how you feel after someone you love has died. So we reached out to all of you and we asked you a couple questions, and we asked you to share us with some of your questions, and we have compiled them, and I have collaborated with two of my friends, Lisa and Jennifer, who will introduce themselves to you later in the show. And we're going to answer your questions, and we got so many, so we're not going to be able to answer them all, and I'm sorry for that. But we are going to do our very best to answer what we can. And I'm going to start. So the question that had the most common theme was, how long will this go on? And by that, the different choices for that was depression, sadness, ache, sorrow, loneliness. There are so many different feelings that grief elicits. My answer is that when people tell you it's going to get better with time, I struggle with that because I lost my sister 6 years ago, and my grief now is harder. It's more painful. I feel a deeper sense of loss. So I personally, I don't think it goes away. I don't think you will ever stop feeling something because you loved this person so much. You don't stop loving them. So how does the grief stop? You're going to continue feeling a myriad of different emotions. My advice to you would be to honor them. And some days you will not want to get out of bed, and I get that. And some days you'll be laughing and smiling, and you'll be thinking to yourself that you shouldn't be doing that because you're supposed to be sad. I don't think that's true. I think you're allowed to laugh as well as cry. And I don't think it goes away. I just think I think it changes its appearance. It's sometimes wearing big heavy coats, and sometimes it's wearing a summer spring top. You just don't know how it's going to appear in your life. So just go with it and feel all the feels. And please do not let anyone tell you that you are supposed to be done grieving at a certain point, because I'm in it 6 years later, and I think my ache is deeper and stronger. And so I don't think there's a time frame. So I'm going to hand it over to Lisa, who's going to tell you a little bit about herself and what she thinks about that question.
Thank you, Gabby, for inviting Jen and I here today to talk with you about grief. I am a hospice social worker, and I've worked in end of life for about 15 years now. I've worked in hospice and emergency medicine. So I've seen a lot of grief over the years, including sudden loss and the loss from someone who has been ill for quite some time. And then this last year, I was in an experience where I had several of my own losses. My mother-in-law died in August, and I also lost both of my grandparents this year. And my kitty cat of 19 years, which I have to say has really been a significant loss that I didn't expect to be as hard as it's been. And I have a close friend that's on hospice right now. So I have some of my own grief surrounding that already. So that's kind of my experiences and where I'm coming from. And in answer to the question of how long grief lasts, I agree with Gabby that there isn't a timeline. I also believe that grief kind of ebbs and flows. And I tell myself and I tell other people that how you're feeling right now is not going to be how you feel forever. Gabby's saying that she feels the loss of her sister deeper now than she did before, and it's been 6 years. That doesn't mean the whole 6 years she's felt the same type of grief. And so I think it can be important to think, while the grief may last, difficult feelings you may be experiencing may not, they're not going to feel this exact way forever. So that helps me when I'm struggling. And then in terms of timeline, I think the first 6 months to a year is filled with tasks and shock. And so typically what I see when I'm supporting people in grief is that the first year is in some ways the most supported year. And then after that, things become really, they do get harder overall. So if you're in that first 1 to 3 year time and it feels really, really hard, that is very common from what I experience. And Jen, would you like to introduce yourself now?
I would love to introduce myself. Thank you both. I'm so honored to be a part of this group. My name is Jen O'Brien, and I am here because in 1983, my only sibling, David, was killed in an accident. I was 18, he was 13. And so that was a very young introduction to a sudden traumatic death and a devastating grief. But it was also a time when the world didn't handle grief very well, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Some years later, my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and she died about 5 weeks after the diagnosis. I've worked in healthcare my entire career, and I'm the only one in my family who has. I'm not a clinical person, but I have exposure to a lot of clinical folks, so that when an uncle of mine and my grandparents were becoming ill, I was the connection that my family had to end of life. And of course, I was more experienced than the rest of them with personal loss. And then I met and fell in love with a doctor named Bob Lemberg. And one of the reasons I fell in love with him was because he had, after years of being a successful surgeon, had retrained in hospice and palliative care when he could no longer operate because of a neck injury. And I knew how important hospice and palliative care was to families and to people like me. And so that was pretty engaging. And we fell in love, and we had this wonderful, wonderful life. And he would come home and he would tell me about patients and their families, and we would talk about how wonderful and difficult at times it was to support them in that. And then he got diagnosed with a stage 4 metastatic cancer and lived for 22 months following that diagnosis. And I took care of him, and he died 4 years ago. And so I will answer that question because I have I have a range of nearly 40 years that I have lived with the grief love of my brother, and then just 4 years since Bob died. And so I can tell you one thing's for certain. Time is linear, grief is not. Grief is not linear. Um, I think, Lisa, you absolutely nailed it. It is, the first year is hard, but the first year is supported. You will hear from people on your first Christmas after the death of a loved one. I have actually said for many years, since the second year after my brother died, I said, the second year is actually harder because the reality has set in and the people have disappeared. So I think it goes on. I think you'll notice a 6 months or a year, you'll notice at a certain point that at least I have, that I don't break down as often. And I break down crying or feeling that sense of paralysis. Uh, um, it doesn't happen quite as often or quite as sort of constant feeling. And so that happens a little bit, but it can still sneak up pretty quickly in a lot of cases. So I'm with both of you. There's no timeline. There was no timeline to my love for these people, and so I'm not going to put a timeline on the grief I have.
Wow, both of you answered that so so well. Thank you. Jennifer, you said something that was really powerful that I want to make a point to everyone, and I think you'll agree, is that if you know somebody who has lost someone, please don't stop asking them how they are. Please don't, don't step back. You don't have to be all up in their stuff, but at least send them a note. Let them know that you're thinking about them, because like she said, the second year is a little harder, and the support seems to be a little less. So please don't stop checking in. We all want to know that we're being thought of during a time that our heart is aching. Would you agree, both of you?
Absolutely.
So gosh, you guys, we received so many questions, and I just want to really tell all of you, for those of you that submitted something, I just want to say thank you, because that takes some bravery, and certainly some thought and intention, and we really want to honor that. So we've each got this collection of questions that we're going to kind of draw out of our dish. Yay. So I'll start. Okay, my first question I'm going to answer is, my mom was diagnosed with terminal cancer. She is still alive and fights every day. She amazes me. However, ever since her diagnosis, and even though she is still here, I cry all the time. Even after a good day with her, I'm afraid that if I'm grieving her this bad now, while she is still with us, then how bad will it be when she isn't? Um, you know, I think all three of us could answer this in a different way. I think that, you're anticipating her death. And if I could give, as a hospice nurse, I see this often. I see them at the bedside. They're playing out in their head what happens next, and anticipating the ache and the pain, and all of that is very valid and real. But what I want to remind you is to focus on now, because you only get this chance once. You will never get this moment, these last days, hours with this person again. And if you're lucky enough to have that much time with them, focus on that. Make these moments matter. Set some legacy, which I love to do, which is maybe photos, maybe do some videos together, or make some last memories together, because that's going to be what might help soften the ache after this person actually dies. So my advice would be to be really fully present with the now, because you only get this time once. That would be my thought. Do you guys have anything you want to add to that?
Well, I 100% agree with that, Gabby. And as I was saying, I have a friend on hospice that I have recently had some time together with, and I worked so hard at being present and intentional with that time. And so I fully believe that. And I want to say that it's really normal to be struggling. You're not only taking care of your loved one, you are grieving them. You're grieving what they can't do already. You might not be able to talk to them in the same way about issues that are going on in your life. You might not be able, you may be watching someone physically decline and get smaller and smaller, or weaker and weaker. And that's really hard. It's really hard to see. But I do believe that some of the work we do in our grief, our anticipatory grief, that grief before someone dies, it does ease a little bit. It helps our minds adjust to the concept that this person's going to be gone. We're still going to be surprised, in shock, struggle. but there is some kind of rehearsal that we do, and some beginning to think ahead. Oh, mom probably won't be here next Christmas. Oh, this is probably something I'm not going to have her support with. And again, we want to be present with them, but we also want to create some space outside of when we're with our loved one to allow ourselves to have some of those feelings. And I
Well
think,
said.
Jen, you had some thoughts on this one too.
I do. I have some distinct thoughts on this. I kept a journal while my husband was ill. It's an art journal. And I suffered from anticipatory grief acutely because I had lost my mother and my brother, and I knew how much it was going to hurt when Bob died. But there's a page from my journal that is devoted to anticipatory grief. It's very short, so I'll read it. Anticipatory grief, grieving before your loved one actually dies. It's real. It can be huge. In one study, 40% of widows reported anticipatory grief as worse than the grief after death. I am suffering from anticipatory grief. The key is honoring my anticipatory grief while not allowing it to spoil the time we have left together.
It's so beautiful.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's big. There's no question about it. And we all know that when you try to ignore something big, it never goes well.
You know, and one of the things I've noticed too, sitting at bedsides, is no matter how much time you have to prepare for it, right? You could have months, sometimes longer, that you've worked yourself up to this point. You know it's coming, it's inevitable. But the moment that last breath is taken, it's as though you had no idea this was happening. So you can anticipate, the shock is going to hit just as hard because it is a shock.
It is.
Lisa, do you have a question?
I do. Well, I have a bunch of questions. I'm going to pull one out and see. My sister died in the hospital. She was not on hospice, and I didn't have a team of people to help me. Who can I call for advice or support? This is a great question. If someone is on hospice, they typically have their team of professionals who will likely check in after the person has died, as well as bereavement services that are provided by the hospice. A trick, though, is that I work at a hospice, Gabby works at a hospice. A lot of the hospice support groups are available to members of the community. Most hospices, you don't actually have to have a family member on hospice who died to participate in the grief support groups. So that is one suggestion, is I would encourage you to reach out to the local hospices in your area. You can ask them for a list of grief support groups. A lot of places are doing over Zoom right now, and people have adapted and it's going well. And then the hospice will also have a list of therapists in the area that can support you that have experience in grief. So if you're looking for additional support, your local hospice has a lot of resources for you. Also, I have found that social media holds so much support. I mean, as evidenced by Gabby's Facebook page with all of you. But in addition, I just started following hashtags on Instagram of grief, and wow, there's so many people out there doing such great work. Megan Devine, she has this incredible book saying it's okay that you're not okay. She has a website, Refuge in Grief. Anyway, there's a lot of resources out there to support you, even if you weren't involved in the hospice agency.
Excellent.
Okay, I'm going to pull a
Okay,
question.
Jen, your turn.
I haven't cleaned out his closet. I can't bear to do it yet. It's been 2 years. When am I supposed to do this? so I can relate. But again, we get back to that issue of time. And again, the Gregorian calendar does not apply on this topic. I can tell you that my husband's closet, I occasionally in the months after he died, I would open it and lean in and take a deep breath and smell his smell. And it was so wonderful. And you know what? I'm okay. I swear to you, I'm not crazy. You're gonna have to take my word for that. But anyway, so there really isn't a supposed to in terms of when are you supposed to do this. I have an aunt who lost her husband several years ago, and his clothes are all still there in his closet. So there's no rules, no rules. Short of not doing harm to yourself or others, there are no rules.
Excellent. Yeah, I have a gentleman that I visit once a week and check in on him. He's 91. He lost his wife a little over a year ago. And, you know, he's in his 90s, but her whole closet is still full. And he asked me the other day if he was supposed to empty it. And I said, well, you know, do you go in there and look in the closet? I mean, is there some significance to keeping it there? He goes, I know she's dead, but when I go into the room and I see the closet, it reminds me that she's still here. And I'm like, then keep it. There is no, just like you said, there is no rule. You know, as long as you're not hurting yourself or someone else by your choices relative to how you handle your grief, I say just do what comforts you, what makes your heart feel full.
I would, you're reminding me of one thing. Bob did ask me to give some items of his clothing to certain people, and I did that. And that's a great, to me, that was just such a great honor. So I did try to do that as quickly as possible. I mean, as quickly as I don't remember that there was any particular timeline, but it was important to me to carry that out. So anyway, for whatever that's worth.
It's worth a lot. So I have a question. I actually have 3 questions, and I'm going to kind of read them all because they're a collection. The first one is what shouldn't people say to someone experiencing grief despite how long it has been? Another one is people tell me to stop talking about him. I don't want to stop talking about him. The other says, I miss her so much. It's been 10 years. It hurts more now than it did 10 years ago. Is that normal? Relative to it hurting more, I think that both Jen and Lisa answered that really well. You know, I can speak from my own experience with my sister Laura. I don't grieve for her every single day, but I do feel it still just as much, if not more now than I did then. So I don't think there's a time frame. And relative to, you know, what you shouldn't ever tell someone is to stop grieving. Please do not tell someone something like, or say something like, shouldn't you be over that by now? Why would you ever say something so hurtful to someone who is feeling such deep loss for someone they loved? It is not for us to determine how someone else responds to, how long for, or any of that relative to their own personal grief. So what should you say to them? Let them know you're there. Give them the time and the space they need to work through this in whatever time or space they need, and honor that. And if you're uncomfortable with them and their need to continually talk about their husband, or in my case, my sister, then maybe you need a timeout, because I think you need to step away from the person that, if that's bothering you so much, then step away, but please don't put on them how you're feeling, because I'll tell you what, if you haven't lost someone you love, then you're never going to fully understand what that feels like. And I think people deserve to take their time. So what you don't say is to stop feeling, and you don't say they should be over it by now. And what you do say continually, for as long as you know them, how are you doing? And when it comes to holidays or birthdays or the anniversary of their death, check in on them. Those are really important things to say and not say in order to allow the person that you care for to walk through their grief on their terms. Did you guys want to add something to that? Because that's kind of a biggie.
Well, talking about someone that you love that has died is so important. I mean, grief can just feel so lonely, right? It's like you're in your head and you're walking around and you're like, I can't believe she's not alive anymore. And I find myself looking for opportunities to bring up my mother-in-law. I mean, I miss her so much. And I just, any chance, I know I'm talking about her a lot, because she's on my mind a lot, right? And so I want to share stories about her. And I think the things that I really have trouble with hearing people say is that everything happens for a reason. That response to me is so dismissive to me and to that person that I've lost. And I just feel like it's a way that we try to make sense of things, and we want things to be nice and neat, and they're not. So that I think that is still kind of said quite a bit. And I really want people to be thoughtful of when you use that phrase, because there's so much hurt. And the death of a child, it's very hard to say that happened for a reason. So I agree. And also, I think the biggest thing you can do to support someone in grief is listening to them. I mean, when I sit and allow for people to be silent, I can sometimes just sit there for 45 minutes or so, and they'll keep talking because there's a lot to say. But we fill that space because we're uncomfortable. But if you can just sit and listen, oh, it's such a gift to someone who's struggling and who's experiencing pain.
I'm gonna dovetail here on this one too. And I want us all to think about major life events, right? Getting married, a wedding, and how people talk about and prepare for the wedding, and then they attend, and then they go on a honeymoon and they talk about how wonderful all of it was. And when so-and-so, got up on the table and danced to AC/DC or whatever it was, right? And it goes on, and we talk about the new home, and then someone gets pregnant and we're going to talk about the baby, and then the baby's born and we talk about the baby and the development of the baby. And these are major life events, and we talk about them forever. And the death of a loved one is a major life event. And so why wouldn't we talk about it forever? Nothing about death erases any of those other things. It is indeed a major life event. I love my brother and my mother and my husband as much as I ever did. And I want to talk about them. And the people who say trite things, either because they don't understand or because they want to shut me down, I'll probably just end up finding someone else to talk to and someone else to listen to.
That was excellent.
Mm-hmm.
What great advice. And you're right. It is a life event. And I think it is just as important as all the others. And you know what? I actually like talking about my sister. In fact, it brings me joy when I get to bring her up. And I don't talk about it in a sad way. I talk about how much I love her. And you know why I talk about her? Because she's mine and she was good to me. And you know what? I wish that she was here so she could watch her children grow up and her grandchildren grow up. And so when I see them and I watch what they're doing, I think about her. She doesn't go away. They don't go away. Let's just talk about them. And yes, Lisa, listen. We all should practice that. Oh, you guys, this is so great. All right. I have to clean out my parents' home soon with a lifetime of things that I know I will struggle letting go of, but I don't have the room to take any of it. Any creative ideas on how to reuse items or just ideas on how to deal with giving things away? You know, this is a really good question. I am, since I've been working in hospice especially, I am very aware of my own mortality. I'm also aware of the responsibility that will fall on my children when I die. So I have actually started cleaning my house with the idea that they won't struggle with finding homes for my things. So I have gotten rid of, you know, the crap stuff, the hoarder stuff, the stuff I don't use anyway. So when they do have to go through my home, which I'm anticipating them having to do, it will be maybe almost fun because they're not going to find anything secret because I got rid of that. And they might, you know, want some of the things. But in my letter that I've written, which I have very clearly outlined everything I want done when I die, it says, give it away. Sell it if you want to, but give it away. But for you to have to, you know, wonder, like, I don't have the room to take any of it. I get that. Don't feel guilty. What I would suggest is maybe going through the things and finding some significant things that really have an impact on you. For me, when my mother died, I took her blue tape measure that she used to wear around her neck all the time. And I took a couple serving spoons because she used to throw parties all the time. And her favorite serving spoons were always laid out on the table. I didn't have room. I didn't have a place to take all her things. I certainly didn't have a place for furniture. So I have these little things, these trinkets. And that's what I would suggest. Take just a couple little things that remind you, and then maybe put something on your neighborhood newspaper, Craigslist, you know, whatever. We have a thing called Nextdoor here, and just say, you know, take some pictures and just say, these belong to my mom and I'd really like to find them a good home. You know, when I recently moved from a big house to this tiny little one, which I love, but I had a lot of things. And so what I did was I took pictures of things that went well together. And I took this sort of picture, like a chair with a throw over it and a pillow, and then maybe a little side table. And I made these little kits, you know, and I put it out there. Look, I have to move. I love my things, but I don't have room for them anymore. So if you want them, they're yours. Oh my gosh, everyone loved them and they took everything in the kit. So my suggestion would be to keep something because I think you'll want a memento, but maybe make these creative little collections of things and put it out there, and don't feel guilty about letting them go because it's okay. I'm giving you permission.
I have a couple ideas too. One, taking pictures is incredible. You can take pictures of the things you don't have space for that are important to you too, you know, and then that's a way to kind of keep your mom's, you know, the couch that you sat on with her 100 times, or so taking pictures, you know, we all have smartphones now. We can take a bunch of pictures. Also going through the written things. I mean, when my grandma died, I took her diaries and read them at night, and oh, it was so, I have a whole file on my phone of grandma's diary, the pictures that I took that were just mostly the ones that just made me laugh. And I was like, oh my gosh, grandma, I can't believe you said that. So taking pictures. And also when my mother-in-law died, we have a garage full of stuff actually now of our deceased family members' belongings. So we are now in the process of trying to figure out next steps. But we did, she had a lot of close friends. And so we found items that we thought her friends would enjoy. And we gave items of meaning to people. And she helped some before she died with that. But then other things we just thought that this person would appreciate. And when my grandparents died and my parents began cleaning out the house, they were trying to give away stuff so much that anyone that came over learned they had to lock the doors to their car because my mom would slip out and stick a big pot in there or something because she's just trying to get rid of stuff. So it's, people's stuff is hard. It is really hard to know what to do with the belongings of someone after they die. It really is. And it is filled with a lot of emotions. But I agree with Gabby. You don't need to feel guilty about it. You just need to get through it. But take some pictures of the sentimental things and get creative with who might be able to take some of these things that were important to the loved one that's died.
Yeah, if you can, I've done this more times than I really care to recall, but if you can afford to put the stuff in a garage or a storage locker for a period of time, especially if there are other extended family members involved, that is actually a wonderful time to give yourself and others a little breathing room as to, because you can't get it back, right? I mean,
Mhm.
you might in some cases, but you probably don't want to be that person that says, "Hey, I gave you this thing a few years ago and I want it back now." But anyway, so if you have that option to give yourself a little extra time with it in a way that's not, not going to adversely affect you, then or others, then I recommend that. Just because it's a time with a lot of emotion and a lot going on, and you really have no idea how you're going to feel at a later point. And of course, to some degree, you can't control that, but to give yourself a little extra time on that is important.
Mhm.
Very good point. Lisa, do you have another question you'd like to answer?
I do. Okay, I'm going to try to summarize because it's a little bit long. I lost my mom 4 years ago. She was sick, but it was still a shock. She was 68. My husband and young adult children have been understanding, but my dad and siblings have written me off as crazy, and they think I need help and should have moved on. So people grieve differently is the bottom line. Your dad and siblings have their own grief process and you have yours. And I think it's so hard when we compare each other's grief and our grief responses. I mean, in this case, her husband and children are supportive, and I think that that's really important to have that. Now, I'll say that sometimes we can have complicated grief, and we can have grief that really impacts how you're functioning. Meaning it's been years and you are having a really hard time getting out of bed. You have days where you're not eating, you're not sleeping at night. When things persist at that intensity for years, then that tells me that you probably need some extra support. That isn't what this person's question is, but just to kind of clarify, there's certainly opportunities for people to get grief support when they're struggling. And sometimes our grief might be complicated because we have multiple losses in a short period of time. It might be because we had a really difficult relationship with this person and things didn't resolve to a point where we feel good about it. It might be a relationship that other people didn't know about, or that or that other people don't recognize or support. And so there are times when I think it's very beneficial to seek out support. I've been in therapy on and off in my life since I was like 18. I find it so helpful to have someone just listen to me and help me process. I've also been on antidepressants before when I had my second miscarriage and I really was struggling. And I saw a therapist and decided, you know what, I need further support. That was after a period of time, and that was because of these symptoms I was experiencing. But that's just all to say that normal, typical grief is messy. It's hard sometimes to know when you should get help, but I typically believe that there's not a lot of bad that comes out of getting extra support. So if you are struggling, I think it's worthwhile to look into grief support groups. Again, you can call your hospice provider and they can list some grief therapists. And I think lastly, I'll just say, the more we have conversations like this, the more that I think people won't be struggling as much, because they'll know that this isn't typical. This is common. This is what grief feels like. So yeah, I think I see you nodding, Jen. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Only to echo yours. I too have been spent time in my life in therapy, and I've always said it is the best time and money I have ever spent, both personally and professionally. I mean, we get objective, learned guidance for things that are so much smaller and more minor in our lives than our hearts and heads. And so why wouldn't we get that that learned objective help? So yeah, I'm a big believer. And I would say to this person that asked the question, the word "should" is a real problem. If you have relatives and relations and friends who are saying the word "should" to you, you should be over this by now. You should do this. You should be acting this way, not this way. You should be crying more, not laughing as much. I think it's a lot like another word that begins with SH, but is only 4 letters long. And so I say bullshit.
Both of you made a really good points, and we'll go back to what you said, Jennifer, about, Lisa. No one grieves the same. You could have 3 siblings who all lost their mother, and one might close off, right? Like just not react. One might be incredibly emotional and crawl into the bed and cry and sob and just go for days or longer. And then you might have another who's just filled with anger. All of those emotions are real and valid. And to compare how you would react to someone else's grief is inappropriate. And on the other side of that, to reach out and ask for help because of the way you might be reacting to your own grief is healthy and it's productive. And I too, I'm right there with you guys. I have gone through my own therapy, and life in general is hard. Every day is hard. We struggle with so many things. So please don't tell someone how to feel. Let's do that on our own. We work through our own stuff and let someone else do the same. And if you think that they're struggling, perhaps just say, do you think maybe you'd be okay if you had someone to talk to? Encourage the support instead of criticizing them for how they're responding.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Abby. When your kids or your spouse, someone who depends on you, on your relationship day to day, says to you, I'm worried about you. Yeah, I think that's time to go, okay. What's worrying you, and that sort of thing. And it's worth exploring that. That's a little different than your adult siblings and your father or whomever deciding that you should be handling your grief basically the same way they're handling theirs, and that's not going to work.
I'm just super grateful that we're having this conversation. So our time is running short. Jennifer, I'm going to leave you with one last question.
Oh my, wait.
Oh, the pressure, Jen.
So much pressure. Just one? Okay. Okay. I can't bring myself to even go back to the city my mom lived in because it's too painful. She's been gone 11 years. I'd rather remember her other ways and not the way it ended. It was very painful. And a similar question to this one that's right below it is, I can't go to the places that used to be special for me and my husband, but they were my favorite places. I love this question because I can relate to it. My brother died where we grew up in the state of New Mexico, northern New Mexico, and I for a long time only went back when I absolutely had to, and had a very difficult time going back there. And you know, like we've said, no rules, no should, as long as you're not doing harm to yourself or others. So if you can't and you don't want to, then don't, you know, if you don't have to. The second question is similar but different in the sense that this person seems to be implying that they would like to go to those places, but it's really hard. And I have been in that situation as well, especially in the last few years with my beloved Bob. And so what I've done is just be gentle with myself. And when I could go to the coffee shop or the restaurant or wherever, I did, and I didn't expect a lot of myself. If I had a sudden temporary upsurge of grief or pain, you know, emotional pain, then, you know, get the coffee to go. I'm gonna, right? Like, and I get out of there and congratulate myself on doing it. And then another time I've done that type of thing, it went very well. And so I just sort of relished in that. There is a time when you're in that place where you can say, yes, this is where we had our first date and it was glorious. And I am here and I can feel him here with me. And it's good and it feels good, and then you've done it. And you may go back another time and it doesn't feel so good. So that's okay too. You know, again, go easy on yourself. But yes, I have been in both of those situations, and I just gave myself a break and did the best I could. That's all we can do.
Thank you.
I think also it's, you know, some people love going back to the places that they shared with someone who has died. And you know, again, it just is why grief is so different for each person. You know, I know people who really lean in to everything that reminds them of the person who has died, and they continue all traditions and go to all the places. And then other people kind of, you know, avoid a little more and say, you know what, that was for that person and I'm not really gonna do that anymore. And both are okay. And it just reminded me of one small tangent, which is people are very afraid when they're caregiving for a family member on hospice or who's seriously ill, that this is how they're always going to remember their loved one, and that they don't want to see them like that because that'll be the memory. And that is a valid fear. It is very hard. But what I always try to remind people is that they have a whole bunch of other memories, and that they won't just remember their loved one sick. They won't just remember their last days. They'll remember all the other things too. And so if you are experiencing that now and have someone who's very sick, just if you can just remind yourself, like, I'll have these memories, but I'll have many more as well.
That was lovely. My first husband died in we met, we were young. We met working in a gas station. We lived in a very small town with, very few people in it. And so the gas station was kind of the hangout place. And that's where we met, and we worked together there. And since then, the building has been turned into something else. But whenever I go back to Mendocino and I go back to that spot where the gas station was, that's that place, and that's my memory. And for me, I actually like having places that I can go to. And but I get it. I think it's definitely a twofold question. Very nicely answered. Thank you both.
Right. And keeping that in mind when there are other people. So like back to a couple questions ago where we've got a family, right? Somebody likes going back and somebody doesn't. And so accommodating, right? Can we split up for a couple of hours because I really want to go back to that place and I know that you don't. When you've traveled back somewhere or something, I think that's just accommodating these very different non-linear grief paths is the answer that just keeps coming up.
And that
Well,
really is about not judging,
uh,
right? And I think if there's one, if I have a couple final thoughts.
go ahead.
Okay. One is, as we talked about, listening, right? Checking in and listening to their answer. And second is not judging people based on their grief responses. If you've been through grief and you had a different experience, that's still your experience. You're still not an expert on their grief. So as open-minded and judgment-free that we can be, the more supported and loved that grieving person can feel.
Any last thoughts for you, Jennifer?
I think those were pretty good. I wouldn't want to, I don't want to jeopardize that. No, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. It's yeah, it's exactly and I guess I would add that that if you do check in and somebody appears to not be interested in sharing, don't let that stop you from doing it again. And certainly when someone reaches out to you, be there. Because it isn't always easy to talk about it in the moment that someone wants to be there for me. Right. So, but I don't want that to mean that they never try again. They no longer are interested in listening or checking in. So it's tenuous.
That's a good point.
That was really wonderful. Both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabby.
To all of you at the Hospice Heart, this what we did today was because of you. We watch you daily reach out to someone who has exposed themselves, who vulnerably shared their feelings about what they're going through for someone that they've lost, and that grief. And so that's why the three of us have collaborated, is because we want to honor your feelings, and we want to acknowledge that the way that you feel is valid and that you are not alone. And I want to say thank you to anyone out there, whether you're on the Hospice Heart Facebook page or you're just in general. When you reach out to someone who's having a tough time, that's kind. And if we all did that just a little more, imagine what a difference that would make in our world. So please, like both Jennifer and Lisa were saying, listen. If someone has something to say, listen. Don't judge. Don't determine how someone else should respond to grief or loss or anything in between. Honor their feelings, respect their feelings, and please don't stop checking in on someone. And if you have a neighbor that might live alone, who might have lost, especially someone who's elderly, or an age isn't really a factor necessarily, but anyone, if you know someone, your next door neighbor who has lost somebody to death, and you know that they're probably sitting over there alone, check in on them. And if they're not being social, if they don't answer the door, put a note in their mailbox, because in general, people don't want to feel alone. And if you reach out and you acknowledge their existence and their feelings, and you listen and you provide that compassion, they'll feel less alone. So, ladies, thank you so much for joining me today. This was incredible and powerful and lovely, and I am so thankful for both of you. And to all of you out there, please honor your hearts and take really good care of you.
Thank you for having us, Gabby.
Thanks, Gabby. It was wonderful. Thanks to both of you. I really enjoyed this.
Me too. Bye-bye, everyone.